and then, welcome to my book corner. Today we're talking about the latest book from Rex Burke and a little bit of self-promotion before we get into that. Rex very kindly joined me for an interview on the channel. If you want to see what he had to say about this book, his previous works, his writing process and possible future plans, then I will link it up above for you to go and check out. But today we're talking about his latest title, Special Delivery. This came out on March the 14th of this year. Comes in at 263 pages on Kindle ebook, 324 for paperback. As always, we shall talk about the story, the characters, the world building and the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end of the video. Let's dive straight in. So this is a relatively standard sci-fi plot, one you will have read before, and it's a standard plot because it's one that works really well. You begin with Dix, who is a trooper who is in like a trench, and they've been sent out to deal with a minor rebellion on a mining planet. Just somewhere, back end of nowhere, the Federation just wants its ore and just wants the miners to stop, so they just want them being stopped. Read into what you think they mean by being stopped here. The leader of this sort of battalion, this group, is fully academy educated and never been in battle themselves. Despite there being plans in place, they overrule these plans and in a very Blackadder-esque moment basically orders a charge up a hill, which goes about as well as you can expect, leading to the death of the Sarge, who is kind of Dix's mentor figure. And at this point, Dix realises that the person in charge is an imbecile. Already knew they were an imbecile, but finally decides to act upon this, striking the senior officer and enacting their own plan, which worked with no further casualties on either side. Upon returning, rather than getting the hero's welcome they should have got, they are clapped in irons, so to speak, and shipped off ready for court-martial for striking a senior officer, which is treason and there for execution. Upon arriving at the prison space station ship, I can't remember which it is, they're sharing a cell with a shady businessman before they get dragged out, and basically a shady woman named Galloway offers them a chance to have their sentence basically commuted in return for them taking part in a shady special ops operation. The sort of operation that the powers that be do not want any involvement with, at least officially. So this is very much a case of you have a group of expendable people to send off and do the government's dirty work, and the government can just go, wasn't us, if they get caught. Cue group of misfits, people who don't get along, trying to work together to perform the mission. And the mission in question is there is a planet way over there that our enemies are currently in charge of. The local population are under the heel. They have a secret weapon stored somewhere off-world. Go get weapon, deliver to the actual population, and get out as fast as you can. And they'll use the weapon to throw off the yoke of oppression, so to speak. But it's never quite that straightforward. This works really, really well for a couple of different reasons. Starting with the character interactions, this is very much a character-driven story first and foremost, using the tropes as a vague outline. And also it keeps the pacing up because you constantly have this sense of danger and almost like a ticking clock effect going on. And it does open up several potential twists and turns along the way. So despite the story being relatively standard sci-fi fare, it does an amazing job at allowing the characters to really breathe, which then fetches us on the characters themselves. Following the conversation with Rex, one thing that he mentioned to me was that his focus is not on world building but on dialogue. And knowing that going in, I actually focused a lot more on it here to see what he meant. And completely right. Dialogue was always the best part of Rex's book previously, and it really does shine here in building the characters up especially when you consider that this is a much darker and more bloody book than the other books that Rex has done so far. And the dialogue and the banter really does help level out what could have been quite a dark and grim read at times, but because of the way the characters interact, there's a certain level of banter and levity there that balances it really, really well. And actually, I would argue, works better because it's balancing darker moments as well. I'm only going to touch on a couple of characters because I don't want to spoil stuff for later on in the book. Dix is the first one that we meet, as already mentioned. Very much had a mentor figure who died because of stupid orders, and Dix has a really interesting kind of character development because they're kind of the most vanilla of the characters in many ways. They are the relatively loyal soldier who is aware of the job that they do and how immoral it sometimes is, but they are still at their core loyal to the institution that is the Federation. But also, they've always been a trooper, they've never really been in charge. And despite the fact that they may well have been moving up the ladder if they hadn't made choices that they did, they're thrust into a situation where not only are they in charge of a group on a mission, but this group on a mission is an atypical group that does not get along. So you have Dix trying to kind of move into a leadership position despite being slightly uncomfortable with it on both a moral level because of some of what they are doing and also because of some of the people that he's having to do it with. And you have this interesting bending of morals going on here and changes in your own personal ethos, which is really fascinating to look at, especially when you bounce it off the other people that he's with. Vasquez is a special ops fighter, especially good at the murder thing, and just sees Dix as a grunt. And interestingly enough, the only one who volunteered for this, they are Federation through and through. They don't like authority, which is why they're on this mission, but they're exceptionally good at what they do. Very much the loose cannon in many regards. Kill first, ask questions later. And again, you have a softening of the edges that starts to go on as they begin to earn each other's respect, which, to be fair, Dix has for Vasquez straight from the beginning because it's very clear this is a murder machine and that's kind of what she's there to do. Well, then you have the other two primary characters in the group. You have Drake, who is a smuggler, which obviously Dix and Vasquez do not like this at all. This is someone who actively works in the shadows against Federation rules. But in a strange way, Drake is perhaps the most human of the group as well because they're not as indoctrinated into the ethos of the military as everybody else around them. They have these interesting sort of connections, especially to things like their ships and to people as well, which starts to sort of begin to bring in the family feel. And finally, you have Allard. And Allard's a fascinating one, and I'd love a book that's just an Allard spin-off if I'm completely honest, because Allard is ex-military, who was a desertee. So obviously, again, Dix and Vasquez are going to look down on this character because they run away and leave their people in the shit. But there's more depth to that as we begin to get into it. He's very much an oddball character, always seems slightly out of his depth, but he's got an almost supernatural ability to read the ground and the land around him and almost foretell things that are going to happen in a way that nobody else can. And at first, it just looks like he's a complete nut job until they realise that actually what he's saying is accurate. And the reason that he ran away is because of how much disruption battle used to cause to him. It caused him pretty much physical pain, and he had to get away from it. And you have these four very different characters interacting with each other and sort of pulling themselves to be better people, or more complete people at least. And then on top of that, you do have the banter, which starts off quite edged at the beginning and gets more jovial as you get further in. It loses its mean spirit as they get to know together and rely on each other. And also, you have the stuff around the weapon. Now, I can't go into too much here, but once they get the weapon, it really begins to challenge some of their personal views on what they should do because of the nature of what the weapon is and what it can potentially do. And whether, in fact, they should still deliver this. And, you know, there are safeguards in place to make sure that they have to do this or they will die. But it really does at that point kind of flip the script and force more responsibility and an accepting of responsibility that works really, really well. And also coming back to the dialogue, it does a really good job of informing us as readers what's going on without again overloading us. It's very much enough for us to paint our own pictures, which I really did appreciate here. And again, very banter laden, so does an amazing job at balancing the darker moments. The world building is really, really dialogue led. It almost feels like show don't tell from TV shows. What do I mean by that? So quite often in books, and I'm reading Wheel of Time at the moment, you'll have these long, lavish descriptions of what people look like, what places are, what smells and colours are around, and Rex doesn't do that. Almost all the world building comes through dialogue interactions between the characters. So if he mentions that someone's in a military uniform, he doesn't go into detail for what that looks like. And that actually makes this a really variable customization read for different people, if that makes sense. Because two different people might have two very, very different pictures in their head of what certain things can look like. And that actually makes this a really interesting book to discuss. And that's not to say there isn't world building here. Quite often you get a little bit and then the dialogue kicks in and you have the characters discussing what they're seeing, feeling, or doing that then builds out on that world, but it's never detail heavy. It's always based on observation and feeling. So you'll get told about these broken down tunnels, but you don't get the detail of what they look like. So in my mind, it filled in almost like subway tunnels that had collapsed or stuff like that, which is really, really interesting. And with it being so heavily dialogue led and the dialogue being so well done and natural, it works really, really well. And you don't notice the fact that the active world building isn't going on because the passive world building through the dialogue works so well. And especially true when you hit where they get to the final destination and observing what's happening with the local population and the interactions with the locals. That probably does more to describe the world than any descriptive text ever would do. And it's a really interesting kind of approach to consider, and I never picked up on it before, but I really appreciate how Rex does it here. I've already spoken about presentation, covering the dialogue specifically and the world building, and I don't want to rehash that here. But I do need to bounce into it a little bit to talk about the pacing of this. As previously mentioned, this is the most bloody of Rex's books so far by a country mile. This is a lot darker in terms of its subject matter and some of the themes that this explores. But the interesting thing is this still has all the hallmarks of Rex's previous books as well. The idea of community and togetherness and found family, for want of a better word, as well as this underlying humour that runs all the way through. Be that from the numerous pop culture references, most of which I will have missed, or just the interaction between the characters themselves. And the really interesting thing is the way that this is paced with its peaks and troughs, because you have these adrenaline peaks within the story, which tend to be the more action orientated sequences, which again, whilst they are not overly descriptive in the way they are described, they're more often the internal monologue of the characters as things are going on, and a brief description of what they are seeing, but not overly so. It's enough to give you some pretty gruesome imagery in places, as you would expect from military sci-fi. But following that, you have the human moments that balance it, and then on top of the human moments and the discussions and the conversations about what has happened and what to do next, and the ramifications of what have happened, you then have these little bits of banter that begin to sprinkle through, very much like you would see in a normal workplace where you've worked with people for a while or you're trying to deal with difficult situations, and it works really, really well to lighten the mood and stop this being an incredibly dark book overall. And that is not to say it doesn't have its dark moments, it absolutely does. But because you have these two almost parallel and opposite approaches, they balance each other up really well, and they actually highlight each other as well. So the dark moments have more impact, and the lighter moments also have more impact, and they're more likely to land, which I really appreciated. Also worth mentioning, all the characters get a little bit of time to shine in here, which is always good. Obviously, Dix is the main character, but Vasquez in particular and Allard get plenty of time within the book to kind of breathe and come into their own. Drake feels like slightly more underserved than the rest, but again, they do the job that they're meant to do in here really, really well. And there is a couple of little twists in here which are really well done. Not quite sure why I didn't pick up on one of them, but there we go. That's on me for being daft. But overall, this is once again a well-written, well-paced, and fully enjoyable book to read. Final thoughts then, and this gave me the Starship Troopers movie vibe at times, which I absolutely love. Rex once again has knocked it out of the park with this one. This is an easy 4.5 stars out of 5, which rounds to 5 over on Goodreads. I just had a blast with this, and I think, and I'm going to have to consider, I might have to go back and reread some. This might be my favourite Rex Burke book because it balances the dark and the light elements so well, and it's things that haven't really been touched on in the other books. And also, I do like my dark books anyway. But yeah, this might be a new favourite of his. We'll have to wait and see. But what I would like to know is, what sci-fi books do you recommend reading? Let me know in the comments down below. I'll catch you all very soon.